Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-gyo Kim. South Korea elected main opposition candidate Yoon Seok-yeol as its 20th president, after the tightest presidential race the country has ever seen. Right after winning the election, President-elect Yoon vowed to strengthen strategic alliance with the U.S. and build a strong national defense to deter North Korean provocations. Today we'll discuss what Yoon's diplomatic policies will be. Joining me is Sung-in Lee, Professor of Korean Studies and Assistant Professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Policy, Tufts University. Professor Lee is also a Faculty Associate at the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations, Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, Harvard University. Scott Snyder is also with me today. Mr. Snyder is Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the show. Good to have you both today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The latest presidential election was South Korea's most closely fought election. What were your first thoughts about the result of the presidential election, Professor Lee?
Well, Winston Churchill once mused that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those that have been tried before. So with this very slim margin of victory by Mr. Yoon, I think South Koreans can take comfort in that they have elected the least undesirable leader among the many contenders. Mr. Yoon, as slim as his margin of victory over Mr. Lee may be, actually his percentage points, total percentage points of the votes that he garnered is significantly higher than what the outgoing, soon-to-be outgoing President Moon gained in 2017. Some 3 million more votes Mr. Yoon got than Mr. Moon 5 years ago, almost 7.5 percentage points higher than what Moon did. So Yoon does have a mandate to govern, and there are many, of course, domestic and foreign challenges that the Yoon administration will face.
Mr. Snyder, what was your immediate thought when the result came out?
Well, my thought was that the election really put the depth of South Korea's political divisions and polarization on display in many aspects. The election was so closely contested. And I think that it leaves Yoon in a very interesting position because on the one hand, as Professor Lee suggested, Yoon may actually benefit from low expectations given the fact that neither candidate was really that popular. But at the same time, in this environment, especially facing an opposition National Assembly, it's going to be necessary for Yoon to be able to reach out and make deals and compromises, both in order to keep his party together and in order to effectively govern.
And one of the first things Yoon did after he got elected was talking with U.S. President Joe Biden on the phone. Yoon gave a victory speech, and 5 hours later, the phone conversation took place, which many consider to be surprisingly prompt. Mr. Snyder, did this show some eagerness from the U.S. side?
Well, more than anticipation, although that may be there, I prefer to emphasize that it shows respect. And especially given the fact that the president is focused on a lot of other issues in Europe, I think that it probably meant that he and his staff made a point of trying to schedule a call with the new president-elect as a way of making sure that the relationship with the new administration gets off to a good start.
Mm-hmm. And President Biden has been emphasizing the importance of the alliance for long, and President-elect Yoon also has been saying how he would solidify South Korea's alliance with the U.S. Professor Lee, do you sense there could be some chemistry between the two?
I think from Washington's point of view, Mr. Yoon, during the campaign, the president-elect struck all the right notes. He has said that he wants to revive the South Korea-US alliance, resume live combined military drills that have not been held since the first summit meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un in June 2018. After meeting Kim, President Trump, using North Korean verbiage, said these drills are provocative, unnecessary, and expensive. So that's one point scored by Mr. Yoon from the Biden administration's point of view. Also, Mr. Yoon has said that he would stand up to North Korea and to China and try to mend fences with Japan, which are all pleasing signals from the Biden administration's point of view.
On the day South Korea's election result was announced, North Korea's state media reported Kim Jong-un as saying that North Korea will launch a lot of reconnaissance satellites in the period of a 5-year plan, which started last year. And the U.S. State Department said, among many security challenges that the U.S. and South Korea are facing together, the threat posed by North Korea's nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles is at the top. Given the circumstances, Professor Lee, do you expect to see the U.S. and South Korea more aligned on North Korea?
Well, I think the coming weeks and months will be rather turbulent because the North Korean dictator has an extra incentive to test weapons, even very provocative weapons like conducting a nuclear test or an ICBM test quite soon, because this year we know in April, North Korea will mark the 110th anniversary of the birth of the founder, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, on April 15th. It also marks the 10th anniversary of Kim Jong-un's ascendance to the throne, if you will. He appointed himself the first general secretary on April 11th back in 2012, and then 2 days later, on the 13th, he appointed himself the first chairman of the National Defense Commission, and also conducted an ICBM test with foreign reporters who were invited watching. That test on April 13th, 2012 was a spectacular failure, but Kim Jong-un made up for that embarrassment later in the year. On December 12th, North Korea did conduct its first ever successful satellite launch, which of course requires ballistic missile technology. So I think there's an extra incentive to test the United States and the new South Korean president by raising the stakes. So I think there'll be some problems that North Korea will create and then blame President Yoon for doing what North Korea would have done anyway. Kim Jong-un will say this is defensive measure against the hostile policy from the new South Korean administration.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, during his campaign, Yoon made it clear that although he's open to talks with North Korea, he would take a tougher stance when needed. Does this sound very different from what President Moon Jae-in has been pursuing, and how will North Korea respond to this?
Well, I do think that Yoon has a different posture from the Moon administration. I mean, all efforts to grapple with the North Korean challenge involve trying to find the right combination on a spectrum between diplomacy and deterrence, and it's going to be a mix. And I think that President-elect Yoon is distinctly more focused on the deterrence than the diplomacy component, in contrast to Moon. And it's going to be very interesting. I'm really glad that Professor Lee laid out the history of what happened a decade ago, because I think that is very resonant with North Korea's current objectives as related to the satellite testing. And as we know, North Korea likes not only to test missiles and nukes, but also to test new leaders.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, some people would say President Moon's policy was what was keeping South Korea safe. And they would say Yoon's policy will be putting South Korea in a danger by provoking North Korea. What do you think?
Well, it's hard to take that kind of criticism too seriously, because North Korea has continued to show unremitting hostility toward the Moon administration despite its efforts to reach out. And so I think that what North Korea does understand, though, is an approach that is focused on peace through strength. It's actually the same approach that Kim Jong-un has tried to employ. And so the near-term risk is that there's actually a competition to get the upper hand in order to show strength. But longer term, I think that it may actually signal that both sides understand each other at a certain level.
While the Biden administration has been stressing the human rights are at the center of its diplomatic policies, the Moon administration was rather seen cautious about bringing up North Korea's human rights issue. Professor Lee, do you think this will change under Yoon's leadership?
I certainly hope so. I think Mr. Yoon has the opportunity to leave a real mark during his 5-year single-term presidency if he musters up the moral courage to normalize talking about conversations on North Korea's crimes against humanity. How would President Yoon do that? Well, talk about it himself, call on Kim Jong-un to dismantle his horrific political prisoner concentration camps. Surprisingly, no South Korean president has ever said such a thing. And to engage in public diplomacy and with sustained financial support for NGOs and human rights activists, and vastly increasing resettlement support financial support for North Korean escapees, I think then Mr. Yoon's legacy will be no less renowned than that of a courageous wartime leader. But it remains to be seen because North Korea has a way of taming the South Korean leader, whether the leader comes from the conservative camp or the progressive camp. North Korea creates security problems for South Korea. North Korea has agency. North Korea does what it does. I mean, during the Moon administration, North Korea has conducted 3 intermediate range ballistic missiles, 3 ICBM tests, and also a thermonuclear test, and scores of shorter range missile tests. So Moon's legacy, despite 3 summit meetings with Kim Jong-un, is mixed.
During the Moon administration, South Korea tried hard to play a balancing act between the US and China, and now President-elect Yoon seems to be open to an additional deployment of THAAD and is very supportive of Quad, which China seems to be taking note of. What do you expect to see in South Korea and China relations in the Yoon administration?
Well, China has been economically sanctioning South Korea for South Korea's deployment of the US missile defense system, THAAD, since 2016. And Mr. Yoon, during the campaign, has talked about deploying another THAAD battery, because one is insufficient to defend South Korea against North Korea's many missiles. So if President Yoon goes ahead with that deployment, then of course China will bristle, China will complain, and most likely revert to hard economic sanctions against South Korea. This is an interesting new phenomenon, the prevalence of anti-Chinese sentiment in South Korea. Unlike anti-US sentiment, anti-American protests or anti-Japanese protests, we've not seen widespread anti-Chinese sentiment in South Korea, thousands or tens of thousands of people protesting in front of the Chinese embassy in Seoul, for example. We've never seen that. So Mr. Yoon has, I hope he doesn't use it or fan the flames of anti-Chinese sentiment, but it's available to him if he stands up to China and China is viewed by South Koreans as bullying South Korea, then I think that favors Mr. Yoon. His ratings probably will go up the harder stance that Yoon takes vis-a-vis Beijing.
After he got elected, President-elect Yoon met Chinese ambassador to Seoul, Xing Haiming, who conveyed a congratulatory message from Chinese President Xi Jinping. There, Yoon said he's certain South Korea-China relations will develop further. Mr. Snyder, will South Korea's so-called strategic ambiguity continue in the Yoon administration?
Well, that's a very interesting question because during the campaign, candidate Yoon did step on some Chinese red lines, especially as related to the deployment of THAAD. And I think that that is creating an atmosphere of anxiety. I noted that the coverage, the front page coverage in China's state-controlled Global Times showed concern about Yoon's early call with Biden. And it also sent some veiled signals, or maybe not so subtle signals, that it expected South Korea to act in its national interest and not to move too dramatically into alignment with one side or the other. And so I do think that China is anxious, and I think that this is going to be an early test for President-elect Yoon in terms of South Korea's own diplomacy of, how is it possible for him to maintain a positive approach to China, especially if China decides it's going to try to impose penalties on South Korea for perceived closer alignment with the United States.
Meanwhile, the U.S. is imposing new sanctions on North Korea over its two recent missile tests, which were assessed to be clandestine attempts to test the ICBM capabilities. The Moon administration has been arguing the North Korea sanctions should be relieved in order to make progress with North Korea. What will be Yoon's position on sanctions?
Well, I anticipate that Yoon will support the sanctions regime and uphold it because it is part of his broader approach in terms of alignment with the international community on this set of issues. And the international community, has been very clear in its opposition to North Korea's continued testing, with the notable exceptions of China and Russia. And so that actually, I think, is the core of the challenge that the U.S. and South Korea face as related to sanctions, is that there's no longer an international consensus. And it actually puts an imperative on Yoon and Biden working even more closely with each other to try to find ways to impose penalties that will reinforce opposition to North Korea's continued testing.
Mm-hmm. Professor Lee, U.S. Deputy Special Envoy for North Korea, Jung Pak, even said the U.S. opposes reducing or lifting sanctions on North Korea when North Korea continues to advance its nuclear and missile capabilities. Do you think Yoon is in line with this stance?
Yes, I do. And, first came the missiles from North Korea, and then sanctions were implemented in response. So as long as North Korea keeps violating UN Security Council resolutions and conducts missile tests, it makes no sense to call for the relaxation of sanctions. North Korea is in serial violation of international law and, in blatant violation of the UN Security Council resolution. So sanctions will be lifted as North Korea takes meaningful steps toward decreasing its nuclear arsenal, but North Korea is going in the other direction. So sanctions like domestic law enforcement need to be implemented, need to be enforced, which is very labor intensive, takes a lot of effort. So for President Moon to say, let's first relax sanctions and then give North Korea an incentive to denuclearize, I think that's the wrong approach.
And the U.S. often stressed the importance of the trilateral cooperation among the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. However, we weren't able to see a substantial improvement in the South Korea-Japan relations during the Moon administration. Professor Lee, will Yoon be able to change this?
Well, he said he'll make an effort to reach out to Japan, and I think traditionally conservative party leaders have shown greater appreciation for the US-led loose trilateral alliance structure in the region. But of course, South Korea and Japan are not treaty allies. but by virtue of the United States and U.S. treaty with Japan and U.S. treaty with South Korea, the two nations in Northeast Asia, the two democracies, are basically on the same team. How successful Mr. Yoon is able to navigate through historical issues, Japan's lack of forthcoming stance on past war crimes, it depends largely on how the Japanese leadership approaches these thorny issues. But I think the prospects are much brighter for the two nations, for Seoul and Tokyo, to be on the same page and together with the United States, try to advance their national security interests vis-a-vis the other team, which of course is China, Russia, and North Korea.
Mm-hmm. As Professor Lee said, during his campaign, Yoon has been pledging to normalize ties with Tokyo. And he spoke on the phone with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and they agreed good bilateral ties between two countries are essential. Mr. Snyder, do you expect to see the improved bilateral relationship?
Well, I agree with everything that Professor Lee had to say about the Korea-Japan relationship. I think that maybe what's most interesting is that for Yoon to publicly make a pledge to try to restore the Korea-Japan relationship to its highest historical point and to exceed that, in and of itself, is a dramatic and some would argue politically risky gesture in the South Korean political context. And so I applaud that. I think statesmanship is what is required. And I hope that the Japanese side will be able to match it.
And this is my last question for today. There are many challenges ahead of the two allies. North Korea's provocations and the intensifying rivalry between the US and China, and of course, right now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Mr. Snyder, will the allies be able to weather through all these challenges?
Well, we certainly hope so, and I think that the Biden administration has put forward a framework in the context of the Asia-Pacific that emphasizes greater alliance-based cooperation to deal with the Asia-Pacific challenges, and also as a support for what is happening in Europe. In many respects, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has actually been a forcing function to bring like-minded Western allies together. And I think that the election of President Yoon overall is positive and reinforces that alignment based on what he has said during the campaign.
Professor Lee, what should we be watching closely to assess how the two allies are working together?
Well, perception and projection of resolution to stand up to the growing North Korean lethal challenge is very important. The 19th century British parliamentarian Lord Palmerston supposedly said there are no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent national interest. And I think for now, the United States, Japan, and with the election of Yoon Seok-yeol, they are on the same page and are united in projecting this image that the trilateral informal alliance will be revived. The bilateral alliance between South Korea and the United States will be revived. And in the end, with the growing aggression from, of course, Russia and China and North Korea, what is the option? Continued appeasement, hoping for the best? I think that would be a poor policy.
With South Korea's new president being elected, a lot of changes are expected to take place in the diplomatic arena surrounding the Korean peninsula. While many watchers predict the US and South Korea will move towards strengthening their alliance, we'll have to watch closely how the US and South Korea will work together to resolve geopolitical challenges one by one. Professor Lee and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.